Hi, and welcome to a flipped recording. This is Mr. Wahlberg, and we're in episode 3, The New Deal. Let's begin in Roman numeral number 9. In 1932, Franklin Roosevelt was elected president, and when he gets elected president, one of the real selling points is that he has a certain optimism that it doesn't seem like Herbert Hoover had anymore. The Republicans went ahead and nominated Hoover because he was the current incumbent sitting president, but they realized he didn't really have much of a chance at winning to do so. A lot of people, even though whether they outright blamed Hoover for the Great Depression or not, they generally thought that he didn't do enough to combat the Great Depression, and he kind of hung around with that as sort of the rep that he's the president of the Depression. Now, Roosevelt had been a governor. He'd been the governor of New York. He'd been a two-term governor of New York, and he proved to be a pretty effective, reform-minded leader in that role. He had this can-do attitude. He had a sense of optimism that was just very different than what Hoover did and was very appealing to voters. Roosevelt won an overwhelming victory. He caught 23 million votes to Hoover's about 16 million. When you look at the electoral map, it's pretty much a landslide, subpoint B. Now, Roosevelt gets elected in November of 1932, but because of the way that the Constitution was written at the time, before the 20th Amendment, he didn't actually take office until mid-March. So there's this almost 6 month gap of time where he's waiting to assume office. And in that time, Roosevelt used the time pretty well. He tried to put together a group that he referred to as the Brain Trust, a select group of professors and lawyers and journalists that together would be his sort of policy-making team to do so. And then he sets out a set of goals known as the 100 days. The 100 days is actually still a measure that presidents kind of use of how fast they're going to achieve their policy goals. In taking office, Roosevelt had promised 100 days of a flurry of activity, of legislation, of new kind of approaches to try to handle the Great Depression. Maybe the most famous one, and it's really the first thing that he jumps out and does, is the Emergency Banking Relief Act, where he goes and he orders what they call a bank holiday. And basically, he just declares all of the banks to close. In the United States, the whole country, all the banks are going to close. And the reason he did this is because he's trying to combat the bank failures that result out of the run on banks when people don't think they're going to get their money back. So they go to the bank and they demand their money, and they end up bankrupting the bank because they create a run on the bank. Well, Roosevelt decided he was going to close all the banks in the whole country, and no banking transaction was going to happen. So basically, whatever currency you had on you was the currency that America had for 4 days, and then slowly he was going to open up one by one banks that he could declare were immediately solvent. So phasing in how banks would to reopen, and the ones that weren't immediately stable and solvent, he was going to offer and provide loans to, so they could come and the banks could get their feet under them to try to prove basically to Americans that the banks were in good financial shape. So point D. The day before he did that, Roosevelt introduced a radio program that became known as his Fireside Chats. The Fireside Chats were Roosevelt broadcasting. I love this picture. He's actually by a fireplace. Most of them were just done in his office. But he realizes that the president can basically get on the news anytime they want. That's the power of the bully pulpit. And it's Teddy Roosevelt, his cousin, that makes this famous, the bully pulpit. But he starts this series of radio broadcasts. And Roosevelt's really a master of the medium. He's a brilliant communicator in radio communication. He's got this simple, clear language that's reassuring to people, but also shows that he has a mastery of the situation also. But he starts these, they're called the Fireside Chats because people imagine that the President of the United States was just sitting down with him at the family radio in the living room by the fireside and having a conversation about the state of America. And in his first presidential Fireside Chat, he explained why the very welfare of the nation depended on the public support of this new banking system that he was going to lay out. He says, "We provided the machinery to restore our financial system, and it's up to you to support it and make it work." So he basically lays out how banking works and operates, and why not everybody in the town could go demand their money at once, and why that's actually what's causing bank failures, not the insolubility of the banks. Then he explained that if people have confidence in their system, the system will work, and it's really just it's a crisis of confidence that's causing the problem of the banking situation. Subpoint E. Congress took another step to reorganize banking by passing the Glass-Steagall Act of 1933. Glass-Steagall's actually become real popped up in the news again as people want to see different kind of banking regulations. But it opens in 1933, which establishes the Federal Deposit Insurance Corporation, the FDIC program. The FDIC program insures bank deposits up to, today it's up to $250,000 per person per account, so $250,000 per person per account. If the bank goes out of business for some reasons, people's deposits are insured. So again, it's to try to prevent those run on the bank situations that had plagued 11,000 banks in 1929. The Federal Securities Act also tried to shore up the financial system on Wall Street, and the Securities and Exchange Commission to try to go make sure that the stock market is operating fairly and honestly so that people can make good investments and trust their investments to do so. In addition, Roosevelt persuaded Congress to approve a bill allowing the manufacture and sale of some alcoholic beverages, which basically would turn into the 21st Amendment repealing prohibition. Repealing prohibition had the advantage basically of creating tax revenue for the United States. It was a new, not a new, but like restoring that line of income for taxation. And that was kind of the main reason why Roosevelt wanted to advocate it. It's not like he was a booze hound or anything, but it could be taxed to provide a stream of income. So Roman numeral number 10. Now, the farmers are having a hard time. This was, I think we've kind of gone over this, how farmers had a number of situations which had complicated their success. And this is where we're going to introduce what history teachers like to call the alphabet soup of the New Deal. And it's Roosevelt has these like slew of programs that come out, and they'll have a 3-letter or 2 or 3 or 4-letter acronym to them. And I'm not going to expect you to know all of them. It's a tremendous number to try to know all of them, but here's some of the main ones we'll focus on today. The first one is the Agricultural Adjustment Act, the AAA, which sought to raise crop prices by lowering production. It's a supply and demand kind of function. The government tried to basically pay farmers to leave a certain amount of every acre fallow and to leave it unseeded. The thinking was that if the farmers didn't go plant those fields, then they would decrease production, and a decreased production would mean that the product becomes scarcer and the price goes up. It also has the secondary effect is that the soils were pretty worn out as a result of the Great Depression or of the Dust Bowl and the overplanting of the 1920s. If a farmer doesn't plant their field, then they get to let the soil rest and naturally recover itself. Like it'll just grow weeds for a while, and the soil, the quality will pop itself back. In some cases, the crops were too far advanced to actually do it the farmers had planted that year. So the AAA actually encouraged some people to destroy the crops that they had before they came out. So like cotton farmers were encouraged to just plow under their cotton crops. Say, hey, we'll pay you to not grow that and to go box out the market. So cotton farmers were paid to plow it under. Hog farmers were encouraged to decrease pork production and slaughtering 6 million pigs, and basically to not bring them to market at all, but just to destroy the meat on it. That upset a lot of Americans because in the cities there's a real food shortage. That people are lining up in food kitchens and bread, handout lines, anything they can to come get food. Now they're finding out that the government is encouraging farmers not to plant things and to go destroy existing food crops and food sources. And the AAA was pretty unpopular with farmers, especially pretty unpopular with city dwellers, particularly early in the year, early in the New Deal. After a while, as farms became a little more stable, it wasn't so just plain old offensive to people. But that is pretty tough medicine. An especially ambitious program of regional development was the Tennessee Valley Authority, the TVA, which runs through most of, here's the map on it, Tennessee, but also Kentucky and bits of North Carolina. It's this river system that runs through the Tennessee Valley, it's known as. So the Tennessee Valley Authority would put dangets on the river to try to, handle flood control, but also to generate electricity. And the South really was technologically disadvantaged. I don't want to use the term backwards because that's kind of a loaded sentence or a loaded term, but it really was. The South didn't have running water, and it was not uncommon to have houses without electricity. The rest of the country did have electricity and running water, but the South really was lagging behind on that. And the TVA does a couple of things. It puts people to work building the actual like construction projects, but it also becomes a power generation facility and a flood control facility to try to modernize the people living in the South. The TVA is still active today. It's still a way of controlling the flooding on the Tennessee River, and like I said, this is still an active program that began in the New Deal. Subpoint B. Let's talk about some other pieces of work projects that are just now here, plain old work projects. So the government just hiring people to do jobs. Maybe the more famous one around Kansas City is the Civilian Conservation Corps, the CCC, which put specifically young men to work ages 18 to 25 to just do outdoor projects, to build roads, to develop parks, to plant trees. Their projects became part of like soil erosion and soil conservation. They're particularly active here in the Great Plains, planting trees to try to keep flood control and soil erosion projects. Much of the Great Plains and places like Kansas were very active in the Civilian Conservation Corps. It didn't pay a huge wage. It paid $30 a month, which was not even a big number in Great Depression dollars, $30 a month. Here's the interesting thing of it, though, is the individual worker was only able to keep $5 of that $30 a month. The other $25 was sent back home to their family. The workers would be out, in the national forests, on the prairies, on doing wherever the conservation needed to be done. That's where the CCC was working. But their families were elsewhere. They're back home. And the wages of the CCC, $25 of that went back to the families. And I think that's a pretty innovative move to try to encourage family savings and family recovery rather than people just, young men blowing it on their own, I guess. The Public Works Administration, the PWA, became part of the National Industrial Recovery Act, which tried to provide money to states. Basically, if a state were to go and take on a big one of these options, if, say, the state of Kansas was trying to take on a construction project, which would be part of the Public Works Administration, the federal government would provide a certain amount of money to not necessarily match what the state was to put up, but to help contribute to it. So if a state could put up $3 for a construction project, the federal government would contribute an extra $1 for it. Try to encourage states to go develop their own infrastructure, but also develop programs within their territory for their citizens. Now, a lot of people criticize like the Civil Works Administration as just make-work projects and essentially a waste of money. And the rap on some of these stories today, some of the legends of it, is that they were pretty wasteful. I've heard stories that the Civilian Conservation Corps, one of their jobs was they would go to a park and then rake leaves, and they would put them all on one side of the park, and then that crew would leave and another crew would come in and they would just move the leaf pile to the other side of the park. I don't know if that's true, but that's sort of a legend that has survived. These were just make-work projects. They didn't actually need to be done, and they were basically a waste of money. However, the Civilian Works Administration, the CWA, ended up by building 40,000 schools during the Depression and paying the salaries of about 50,000 school teachers, built 500,000 miles of roads. So some of the stuff might have been make-work and unessential tasks, but I think in the big picture it looked like there's some real lasting benefits that came out as a result of it. Subpoint C. The National Industrial Recovery Act also created an organization known as the NRA. Now, some of these acronyms get used in other contexts, and you may know the NRA as the National Rifle Association, but in the Great Depression, the NRA stood for the National Recovery Administration. And the National Recovery Administration was a cooperative of businesses who all agreed to pay their employees a certain amount, but also to agree to a price for whatever the thing they were putting out. So if you wanted to go buy a shirt and you went to a store that was an NRA member store, you might actually pay a little bit more money for that shirt than you would at a different place, but the store that was an NRA that got the right to fly the Blue Eagle would agree that they were going to pay their employees a certain amount and that they were going to engage in trade practices that theoretically were to go benefit the entire market. And you might pay a little bit more money at an NRA store, but it was seen as a more patriotic thing to do. This was actually part of recovering the economy during the Great Depression. Now, I think there's room to criticize the NRA in terms of just microeconomics, like what's good for your family to go do it. I think there's some real room to criticize that. But one of the things that's like so great about the Roosevelt administration, the FDR administration, was that he had this optimistic direction. He's like, we're just going to do this. And if it's not going to work, then we'll stop it and do something else. And I think the NRA is a classic example of that. It also had some constitutional problems. There were challenges of like code violations, that some businesses were participating in NRA benefits, but weren't, like passing it on to their employees, or the NRA members were going and serving large business interests, not small business interests. And I think those are all legitimate criticisms, most of which is outside of the scope of what you'll be expected to know about. But it was, again, just a good example of how Roosevelt is actively trying to manage the Great Depression at the time. Subpoint D. Talked for a second specifically about homes and family life. A number of New Deal programs concerned housing and home mortgage problems. The first one we'll talk about is the HOLC, the Homeowners Loan Corporation, provided government loans to homeowners who were about to lose their home because of foreclosures. So the HOLC was about people that they were homeowners, they were operating in their family, and then fell on hard times. The HOLC would go offer individual loans to families that could go protect their family house. Now I don't think that's still in business anymore. I'm totally unfamiliar with the HOLC outside of a history class context, but there were other programs that still do exist. For example, the Federal Housing Administration, the FHA, was a way of trying to encourage people to go buy homes and do that. And FHA still exists today. And if you are ready to buy your first home when you're done with college and you're ready to start your family, you can go get an FHA loan, and it's a chance that try to encourage people to go buy their first house. There was another program, which would be the Federal Emergency Relief Association. FERA, F-E-R-A, was funded with $500 million to go provide direct relief to the needy. FERA, the Federal Emergency Relief Administration, was plain old welfare. It's direct grants and aid to help furnish food and clothing to the unemployed, the aged, and the ill. And it's an absolute just handout outreach program of FERA. Now, so sometimes it's just like directly given to the people, and it's federal dollars given to the needy. The rest. The other part was given to states to do work relief programs, and FERA would go and try to create jobs within their area. And again, it's not exactly a matching, but it's a contribution piece where if a state's going to put up a certain amount, the federal government's going to put up a certain amount also. The money was going to help people buy food, but it was also a way of trying to encourage people that they're going to make it, that they can get confidence, that this, it's a handout, maybe to go help a person up. Roman numeral number 11. Now, by the end of the 100 days, by the end of that 3.5 month process of the FDR administration, by the end of the 100 days, millions of Americans had benefited from New Deal programs, and public confidence was rebounding. But it's also worth noting that it didn't solve the Great Depression in the first 100 days, or really for the entirety of the first Roosevelt administration, that first whole term of office. It doesn't solve the Great Depression. And President Roosevelt agreed to a policy of deficit spending. He said that they're going to spend more money faster than they can bring in through tax revenue. So it's a policy of deficit spending. Whatever we are today, the $20 trillion or something in debt that we can't blame that entirely on FDR, but we can certainly say he contributed to it because the economy wasn't good. But he was making these huge spending programs to try to encourage people to go back to work and try to push on the economy. Now, a lot of conservatives are pretty against this. I mean, this looked like Roosevelt was spending money he didn't have at ineffectually affecting the Great Depression. I mean, it didn't work. It didn't pull us out of the Great Depression. So there's a legitimate criticism about how money was being spent at the time. There's also a criticism from the left, and this is an interesting position, that liberals were also criticizing the New Deal, saying that Roosevelt didn't go far enough to help people. That one of the things that was keeping us in the Great Depression was that Roosevelt wasn't spending money fast enough. Conservatives were particularly angered by laws like the Agricultural Adjustment Act, which was going and trying to control crop prices, the National Industrial Recovery Act, which they thought the government was taking far too much control over agriculture and the industry. And it's one thing if the government takes over sectors that they haven't usually done. It's quite another if they do that and it doesn't work at all. Subpoint B. And then the Supreme Court Roosevelt ran into trouble with the Supreme Court. Let's make Get my sentence, the words in the right order there. By the mid-1930s, conservative opposition and New Deal received a boost from two important Supreme Court decisions. The first one was in 1935, the court struck down the NRA as unconstitutional. It said that the law was giving legislative powers to the executive branch, and in that confusion, basically Roosevelt was trying to overclaim his power to do so. The next year, the Supreme Court struck down the Agricultural Adjustment Act, and the idea is that agriculture is a local matter and it's not a federal government purview. And I think that you can look back at those Supreme Court decisions, and they're kind of complicated. And again, I don't expect you to be a constitutional scholar here, but in both cases, they're one of those feelings that the Roosevelt has gone beyond his constitutional power to do so. And Roosevelt became really worried that the Supreme Court was going to undo other parts of the New Deal. And so he comes up with this idea. Roosevelt looks back on a little Supreme Court history, and he says, we have 9 justices on the Supreme Court, but there hasn't always been 9 justices. I mean, they started out with like 5 Supreme Court justices and then moved to 7, and now there's 9, and it's been 9 for a while, but there's no law that it has to be 9. It's just 9 by custom. And Roosevelt says, what if I were just to go appoint more people? What if we were just to add like 6 new justices? And so this is called his court packing plan, and he actually proposes it. He says, if I just put a whole bunch of my guys on the Supreme Court, then they won't be striking down my stuff anymore. So this is Roosevelt's court packing plan, proposed in 1937 as a way of reforming the judicial branch. Most people did not like this. Roosevelt's court packing plan, I think the average person looked at it and says, Franklin, I think we call that cheating. You're not getting your way, so you're going to cook the refs. Most people didn't like it. It wasn't very popular. But truthfully, before he really had to pursue it that far, the Supreme Court essentially fixed itself. In 1937, a justice retired, a very elderly justice. Roosevelt was able to appoint his replacement. Over the next 4 years, because of other resignations and retirements and deaths, Roosevelt was able to appoint 7 new justices and pretty much built the Supreme Court that he wanted without having to pack it with his lackeys. Subpoint C. In 1934, some of the strongest conservative opponents of the New Deal banded together to try to stop Roosevelt from getting too far. So a lot of the conservatives look at it and they basically say he's spending too much money, he's overstepping his boundaries, and the New Deal isn't even working, so it's not even worth it. But he also had some critics on the left, and that's for a minute I want to identify a few of them because they're super interesting. The first person I want to talk about, his name is Father Charles Coughlin. He's a Roman Catholic priest from the suburb of Detroit, and he had a radio show. He had a very popular radio show. Actually, today, if his radio show was on with the same number of listeners, he would be among the most popular radio hosts in America. He had these, fiery sermons. He was an exciting, electric, charismatic speaker, and his speeches would combine religious ideas with economics and politics, and he very easily crossed over into political issues, which we don't typically expect out of our clergy today, but Coughlin did it pretty willingly to do so. He started out as a supporter of Franklin Roosevelt and then became a pretty active critic of him because, again, he thought he didn't go far enough. And when he crosses over, this is where Coughlin kind of crosses over into his economic and political side. He says that we should guarantee an annual income. Like if somebody has a job and they're making a certain amount of money and they make more than the guaranteed minimum, then that's great, good for them. But if they don't make enough, Coughlin said there ought to be a guaranteed minimum income and people should get a paycheck, just a check from the government to go make up the difference. And he also said that when Roosevelt took over the banks, when he had that banking holiday and then reinstituted with the FDIC, he said that what we really should do is just totally nationalize all the banks. And this shouldn't be a private money-making business. Just the government should own them all. They should nationalize all the banks. And here's where it got. This got sticky. Then it got tied up into like religious and racial politics. And Coughlin started saying like, all the bankers are Jews and we can't have any of that stuff. And everybody's like, I don't know, Coughlin. That's not really a direction I want to go. It's like the Vatican tried to censor him, but he was so popular he just continued his radio show. They eventually became really anti-Semitic, anti-Jewish, and eventually lost him his support. So Coughlin, originally a supporter of Roosevelt, turned into a critic of Roosevelt, and then became, socially and religiously awkward to continue that. The next person I want you to meet is Francis Townsend. Francis Townsend was a physician. He lived in California. He worked in Long Beach in Southern California. He was a physician and a health officer, so he was working for public health in the West Coast. And he believed that, again, he initially was a Roosevelt supporter, but like so many of these critics, he believed that Roosevelt wasn't doing enough, and he became a vocal critic of Roosevelt. He actually proposed a plan which would provide monthly benefits to the aged and to the poor. It was very popular with the aged and the poor, and he ended up kind of like raising his own profile for that, maybe at the cost of Roosevelt's political credibility, and it ultimately undermined support for Roosevelt. The last person I want to talk about is my favorite person to talk about from this section, and he's a guy named Huey Long. Huey Long had been the governor of Louisiana. He'd also been a United States senator. Huey Long had designs on the White House, expected that he would like to run for president himself. Again, he starts out as a Roosevelt supporter, but again, he thinks that Roosevelt doesn't go far enough to do so. Huey Long, here's kind of some of the exciting stuff about him. He was a great self-promoter, and he had a lot of confidence in his own ideas. He basically proposed an early version of American socialism where it called the Share Our Wealth organization. The Share Our Wealth organization was, basically promised something for everybody. He, lower taxes on poor people and higher taxes on rich people and big handouts from here and there. And the tagline was "Every man a king," and he says it was very popular. By 1935, he boasted having as many as 27,000 Share Our Wealth clubs in every significant and insignificant city in the whole country, 7.5 million members. That was in 1935. And then in 1935, things went badly for Huey Long. And that was that he was assassinated by a crazed gunman named Dr. Weiss, W-E-I-S-S, Dr. Weiss. And he was shot and killed in the back by Dr. Weiss. Now, Huey Long was a guy that had enemies. He'd been in politics long enough that he had amassed an enemies list. And when Weiss killed him, it was not totally a surprise. What was surprise is that Long had his bodyguards, who then turned around and killed Dr. Weiss and shot him like 62 times as he bled out on the floor. And this is one of the great conspiracy theories in American history that, like, who put Dr. Weiss up to it, we'll never know, because the bodyguards inadvertently or maybe intentionally destroyed the evidence. As the initial impetus of the New Deal began to wane, Roosevelt started to look ahead. He's realized that he's coming up on re-election, the Great Depression isn't solved, and that a lot more needed to be done. We call this the cliffhanger, and we'll get to it in our next class.